bill already? Then let's get started. Argentina's peso is perhaps the world's most volatile currency in basically human history. Its currency has reached inflation points of up to 3,000% even in just the past few decades. It's because now can I believe that the policies that the Argentinian and the United States government are passing are counterproductive, and it's time to change course. They would ask you to affirm the resolution and to ultimately dollarize Argentina. The resolution today is the United States federal government should substantially reform its policy towards one or more countries in Central or South America. And to understand what we're talking about, let's look at one background point. You can write it down as Argentina's currency crisis. Again, background point one, Argentina's currency crisis. 3 subpoints for you. Subpoint A you can write down as extreme peso volatility. Again, extreme peso volatility. This is Ethan DiMaggio writing for the Stillman Exchange on October 1st of 2025. He writes, quote, on September 22nd, Argentina's economy dropped 10%, and its currency to Argentine peso has lost 99% of its value over the past decade. Argentina is staring down another wave of financial turmoil, with the peso once again at the center of the storm. On the same day, investors pulled out money at such a pace that the government had to spend nearly $700 million in a single day to stop the currency from breaking apart, end quote. Meaning, Argentina's currency crisis is not a historical one, it's a current one. And what's important to understand about our relationship with Argentina is that the president, Javier Milei, is very close with our president, Trump. So when Trump heard about the currency breaking apart, he issued this massive bailout package, which is subpoint B, $40 billion bailout. Again, a $40 billion bailout. This is Walter Bianchi writing for Reuters on January 9th of 2026. He writes, quote, Secretary Bassett said during a press conference that the facility would sit alongside a new $20 billion US currency swap line for Argentina, providing a total of $40 billion in support for Latin America's third largest economy, end quote. What's important to understand about this money is that it has not yet been spent. It's essentially this big fund that Argentina can pull from to use to pay off their debts to the IMF and other countries. Now, can I believe that there's a better use of this money, which is subpoint C, dollarization is the best solution. Again, dollarization is the best solution. Dollarization is when a foreign country stops producing their current legal tender and adopts the United States as its new official currency. This is according to Dr. Stephen Hank, writing for Johns Hopkins University on October of 2025. He writes, quote, dollarization is the lowest cost solution for Argentina's people. It is also the solution desired by Argentina's people. Argentines are estimated to own more dollar currency than peso currency. They own more liquid dollar assets than liquid peso assets, including many dollar deposits offshore to avoid seizures of the kind Argentina has imposed from time to time, end quote. What's important about this is that the Argentinian people don't trust their currency. So they essentially go to the dollar as kind of like how we in the United States go to gold to basically put our savings in dollars to hedge against inflation. They don't want to spend these dollars, and the government needs money themselves to actually pass fiscal policy. That brings us to the second part of evidence. Dr. Stephen Kamen wrote for the American Enterprise Institute on October 22nd of last year. He says, quote, this bailout is a terrible idea and hands over $40 billion in U.S. public funds to Argentine speculators with only a meager chance of repayment for, at best, a short-lived stabilization of Argentina's economy. But the Trump administration is hell-bent on handing over the cash to its political allies in Argentina. It should at least do it right by using those funds to finance full dollarization, end quote. That brings us to our plan. Our mandate is very simple, to use the funds under the financing and swap line commitments to Argentina, and they will only be dispersed in pursuit of full Argentinian dollarization. Meaning, we're taking those $40 billion out, which essentially act as a loan and a credit line to Argentina, and we're repurposing that $40 billion to only be used for dollarizing their economy. Our agency will be the President, Congress, and other necessary bodies. No additional money is required since this has already been allocated to Argentina, which means no new dollars are being printed with our bill. And our timeline will be immediately after you circle affirmative. I have 2 justifications for you. Justification 1 is economic benefit. Again, justification 1, economic benefit. And I specifically mean for the people in the United States. Subpoint A you can write down as protects from Argentina's default. Again, protects from Argentina's default. The big mistake the United States government made was allowing this $40 million to be given to Argentina, despite the fact that they have a very bad history of repaying these types of loans and credit lines. This is according to Dr. Stephen Hank, continuing in his article for Johns Hopkins. He says, quote, in the last 2 generations alone, there have been 1 hyperinflation, 6 banking crises, 5 balance of payment crises, 4 external debt defaults, 3 local public debt defaults, and numerous currency devaluations on top of a near constant punishing inflation, end quote. And in essence, we just gave them a $40 billion loan of taxpayer money and are expecting to see all those dollars back in the United States. I think that's an unwise investment. And instead of giving them a loan, now I believe that money is much better used as an investment into their economy, in which the dollars will be pushed and funneled back into the United States through trade. That's the point B, reduces trade barriers. Again, reduces trade barriers. What's important to understand about dollarization is how it reduces trade barriers between 2 countries. For example, the peso is extremely volatile right now, which means a lot of businesses don't want to invest in new business with Argentina. Whenever they make a transaction, the peso could suddenly drop in value, and then a business loses a lot of money on the deal. And as such, they stay away from Argentina. But the moment you have them basically the same currency, trade increases drastically. And that's reflected in evidence. The impact you can write down as a 400% trade increase. Again, a 400% trade increase. This is according to Andrew Rhodes, writing for the American Economic Review in 2001. It was a study done on the currently dollarized countries at the time, being Panama and Ecuador. He writes, quote, the points estimates of the currency in effect indicate that 2 countries that use the same currency trade more, lots more. The estimate without country fixed effects indicates that currency union is associated with an increase in trade of almost 400%, end quote. Meaning instead of loaning Argentina $40 billion expecting to be paid back, that $40 billion is now going into their economy where those people will use our dollars that we gave them to buy American goods and services and invest in our companies. Let's look at justification 2. You can write it down as challenges Chinese control. Again, justification 2, challenges Chinese control. What's important to understand about our relationship with the dollar worldwide is that it was once the most valued and desired currency. And that's exactly why China's been trying to undermine it. So point A you can write down as US dollar threat. Again, the US dollar threat. This is Dr. Bastian Beschwitz writing for the Governors of the Federal Reserve System on August 30th of 2024. The right quote, China has also been encouraging other countries to start using the renminbi in their bilateral trade with China. For example, in March of 2023, China announced an agreement with Brazil to use the Chinese renminbi and the Brazilian real rather than the US dollar for trade settlement between the 2 countries. This announcement was accompanied by making a Brazilian bank, which is controlled by a Chinese state bank, a direct participation in a Chinese program. In April 2023, Argentina also announced they would pay for Chinese imports in yen rather than the US dollar, though this decision may reflect Argentina's limited dollar reserves, end quote. Meaning, Argentina and China basically agreed to this deal to use the yen in more bilateral trade. Dollarization stops it through subpoint B, increases dollar demand. Again, increases dollar demand. When the dollar is accepted as legal currency, it reduces its credibility and ultimately is traded more with other countries, which is why you should vote for it.
All right, if we're ready to get started.
Yes, sir.
Can I see a copy of your 20C? So you would agree the resolution requires you to prove that your plan is a substantial policy.
That's correct.
All right. And to have a substantial policy reform, Argentina would actually have to accept dollarization, correct?
That's correct.
And you would agree that Argentina's constitution doesn't allow dollarization without explicit approval of Congress.
That's incorrect.
Okay, can you explain?
Sure. The president Milei does not need Congress nor the Constitution to pass dollarization since he controls the Federal Reserve. So all they need to do is change the exchange rate of the peso where it would stop circulating and then you can dollarize.
So just to be clear, your plan relies on Milei being bypassing the Constitution, bypassing Congress.
Correct. It's fully constitutional and legal with the current proposal that he has proposed.
Okay, and it's because he controls the treasury?
That's part of the reason. We have a lot of evidence explaining the legal limits.
And you would agree there's a lot of corruption in Argentina?
I mean, there's a lot of corruption in any country.
All right, and if they don't force people to use the US dollar, then it won't actually do anything, correct?
Well, people already have the dollar in savings. They just don't want to spend those dollars because they'd rather keep them in savings than spend them. That's the whole reason they have it in savings.
You would agree Argentina is deep in debt, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that Argentina has a lot of bank loans?
Yes.
Okay, so same way in 2008 there was a financial crisis, Great Depression in the United States, that happens a lot in Argentina, right?
It does because of poor fiscal policy.
And do you agree that the inflationary processes used by the Milei administration were temporary responses to this bank runs scenario that we've seen?
I disagree. The history of inflation and bank runs and taking out massive loans has been a historical issue in Argentina. That's what we named, like, just in the past 2 decades alone.
Yes.
Multiple instances.
You would agree for the past like 50 years before the Milei administration has been in power, Argentina's economy has been a disaster, correct?
right? And it currently still is, which is why it still lost 99% of its value, and the government has spent nearly $1 billion to keep its economy afloat in single day.
How much does Argentina owe to the IMF?
About $60 billion.
Okay, and how much of this money was going to go to paying off that debt?
The entire $40 billion was specifically for paying off debt, which is kind of backwards because we're giving them a loan to pay off other loans and then expecting them to pay off a $40 billion loan.
I got you. And you would agree that the best thing long term for the Argentine economy would be to pay off that debt?
I believe the best thing for their economy would be to create stability, because the only way they pay off debt right now is printing massive amounts of pesos to pay off those debts, and then it increases inflation, so they take out more debt to ultimately finance the
And
economy.
you would agree they only accepted a little bit, like $3 billion of that currency swap?
No, so they accepted it. So basically, debt has like deadlines where you have to pay back by. So they took out $2 billion to pay off their closest deadline, but they could still pull from the rest
And
of the
they
$40 billion.
paid that off right away, correct?
They didn't pay it off right away. It took them a few months, but yes, they did. The fact is that $2 billion is a lot different than $40 billion we're expecting them to
So
pay back.
just to be clear, you're claiming that they're not going to pay back the loan that we give them, but when we gave them a loan right a couple months ago, they completely paid it off.
Sure, $2 billion is a lot different than $40 billion.
Of course, I no further time.
Leonardo Gabin in 2023 writes, quote, even if dollarizing the $632 billion economy can quickly help to reduce inflation, it is a highly costly process, said Martina Castellano, the head of the Latin American research at the International Institute of Finance in Washington. It's because I agree with these experts that I'm asking about the negative too. What I'm going to do in this speech is pretty simple. I'm going to talk about the solvency of their case and the disadvantages, meaning that if you pass the affirmative ballot, one of two things happen. Either one, nothing happens and you shouldn't vote affirmative because it doesn't produce the benefits that they expect. Or two, disadvantages happen, meaning that it produces the opposite of what they intend to happen. Let's jump into those arguments. The first one I'd like you to write down as the root issues remain. Once again, the root issues remain. The affirmative team seems to think that the peso is the problem, but we as the negative team would argue that it's the economy of Argentina and it's the people, not the people of Argentina, but the leadership of Argentina that are the problem. And I'm going to prove this to you by looking at a piece of evidence, and then after that I'm going to go through about 6 or 7 subpoints. I did not mean to say that. And I'm going to look at each sentence in the evidence and explain exactly what it means. So they started off, this is according to Leonardo Gabin in 2023. Quote, a dollarized economy will lack the flexibility to adjust to shocks, particularly in a more interconnected world economy, featuring widespread floating exchange rates under inflation targeting regimes. Also, the asymmetry with the U.S. economic cycle could lead to policy proselytizing, Castellano said. In contrast, the macroeconomic and policy imbalances it creates remain, given the option to avoid fiscal discipline by exhausting all possible financing sources, including asset sales and pension funds, end quote. I understand that was complicated, so let's jump into the subpoints. Subpoint A is imports U.S. monetary policy. That's they import U.S. monetary policy. Here's the sentence that says that. Asymmetry with the U.S. economic cycle could lead to political proselyticality. I pronounced that wrong earlier. And it means that Argentina and the United States don't experience economic booms at the same time. And if Argentina dollarizes, then the Federal Reserve effectively controls Argentina's monetary conditions, even when the U.S. policy hurts Argentina's economy. Subpoint B is does not fix the structural problems. Does not fix the structural problems. The Senate said macroeconomic and policy imbalances remain, meaning the underlying causes of Argentina's instability still exist even after the dollarization. Subpoint C is does not create fiscal discipline. Does not create fiscal discipline. It says that policymakers can avoid fiscal discipline by exhausting all possible financing sources, meaning that governments still find ways to overspend even if they can't be the ones to print money, including borrowing, asset sales, reserve depletion, or pension funds. Subpoint D does not force the reform. Again, does not force reform. It says the argument that the regime would force policymakers to make the economy more flexible has simply not been corroborated. End quote. What does this mean? Well, it means that even if you dollarize Argentina, and even if this policy goes through Congress, goes through Malay, and the people actually want it, which I'm going to get to later, we see that it doesn't force any sort of reform, it doesn't force any sort of benefits. That's reliant on the government making good decisions. I mean, I can get to the more subpoints later, but let's keep moving on. You can write down my next solvency argument, and this one's kind of a disadvantage as well, as impossible policy. Once again, that's an impossible policy. I'm going to read you a piece of evidence from April of 2026 that says this is an impossible policy to pass because Malay doesn't want it, and the reason he doesn't want it is because the people don't want it. Milei is a people pleaser, meaning he has to be elected in order to get back in office. And unless you want political death for the one ally that we actually have in South America, you shouldn't be voting for their case. According to Coinpedia in April 11 of 2026, quote, President Javier Milei has explained why the process of dollarizing Argentina might be more complex than expected as it has hit a solid roadblock. Milei, who campaigned and won the Argentine presidency on the promise of adopting US dollar as fiat currency, ending the Argentine peso, and disabandoning the central bank, acknowledged a newfound obstacle to his plans. During a recent TV interview, Milei highlighted that the main issue in dollarizing the country was the lack of adoption by Argentines who have failed to embrace the greenback and continue to use the Argentine peso. People don't want it, said Milei, referring to the US dollar instead of the Argentine peso. We've dropped indigenous dollarization. Endogenous, excuse me. That is, if you want, you can make your transaction in dollars, and yet people don't. We've enacted tax amnesty, and yet people don't take advantage of it, he stressed. Furthermore, Milei highlighted that strictly speaking, you can't force things on people. The remarks were criticized on social media, with some claiming that Milei had used dollarization as motivation to entice Argentines to vote for him, only to drop the promise later. But in 2024, Milei stated that he would implement a system of currency competition, allowing Argentines to use their currency of choice, including Bitcoin, to continue financial transactions, end quote. That was a very long piece of evidence, but it says a few important things. Subpoint A is the people don't want. That's the people don't want. The people of Argentina don't want, and on this point alone, I think you should be voting for the negative team. But it doesn't stop there. Subpoint B is political death for Milei. That's political death for Milei. The way that Milei got in power was just basically parroting back anything that the people wanted. And while that might not be good policy for him, what it does for the United States is often he creates policies that are good for us. But here's the problem. If the people don't want it, Milei's not going to do it. The impact is critical U.S. ally lost. That's a critical U.S. ally lost. The reality is that if Milei is not able to be reelected because he's circumventing the Constitution and circumventing the will of the people, he can't get reelected, and our basically singular ally down in Central and South America will be completely lost. The second impact, though, is kind of a double bind. It's or the plan doesn't happen. Again, or the plan doesn't happen. There's basically two options. Either one, Milei doesn't accept this and the plan doesn't happen, or two, he's not able to be reelected. It's a double bind, one of these two things would happen. But let's keep going. The next disadvantage, also known as the solvency argument, I think these are kind of one and the same in this, is delivering political losses. Delivering political losses. This is what I was just talking about a minute ago. Let's read some more evidence. According to Spero writing for Bitcoin News in 2026, quote, during a recent interview, President Javier Milei stated that the largest obstacle to dollarization in Argentina was that the people did not want it. He stressed that even when the government has approved the use of the dollar for financial transactions, people still do not use it, end quote. That's exactly what I was just saying earlier. The people don't want it, therefore Milei does not want it. Let's keep going. This one is a solvency argument, also again another disadvantage. You can write it down as violates the Argentine Constitution. Violates the Argentine Constitution. This was talked a little bit about in cross-examination, but let's read some evidence for this. According to Marinta Jarway in 2023, quote, Chief Argentine Supreme Court Judge Horacio Rosati said that the dollarization plan proposed by President candidate Javier Milei is unconstitutional because it would abolish the national currency, the peso. If a dollarization plan eliminates the Argentine currency, that's unconstitutional. It says so in the Constitution, that's not my twisted interpretation of it. Rosati said in an interview with the Spanish publication El País, published on Tuesday, Article 75, that the Argentine Constitution establishes the country has a central bank and a currency whose value must be protected, end quote. What is this saying? It's saying a couple of things, that Milei can't override the Constitution. If Malachi gets up here and says we don't care about the Constitution, it's not good policy making for the United States or for Milei. But the other thing that we have to understand is even if we were somehow allowed to bypass the Constitution, it's not a good idea for Milei and again for the United States. My partner's going to get to addressing the 1 and C, the justifications that they brought up. But if there's one thing you remember at the end of this, it's that Milei doesn't want it, the people don't want it, and therefore we as the United States should not want it. Thank you.
Your minutes if y'all are ready. Can I see the evidence during your speech, please? Of course. We can agree that Javier Milei ran on dollarizing his country.
Sure.
Perfect. And we can agree he won his election and the people voted for him to dollarize his country.
Right. People used to want it and now they don't.
Okay, perfect. So we can agree that Milei tried to dollarize his country back in 2023.
I believe it was earlier than that, but sure.
Okay, perfect. And we could agree the reason he couldn't dollarize is because the U.S. wouldn't give him the dollars to dollarize.
So before that, he actually did dollarize, and that's what I was talking about. I think it was back in 2001. They did dollarize. It created a bunch of problems, but sure, maybe 2023, I can agree to that.
Wait, we're going to talk about that for a second. You're saying that Argentina has already dollarized before?
I believe so. In 2001, they dollarized and they lost 50% of their money. You can look at the evidence for that.
Sure. We could agree that they pegged the peso to the dollar.
I can read evidence for that quite yet, so maybe this evidence says you can look at it.
Okay, perfect. We could agree if you claim your currency is just one-to-one worth the U.S. dollar, people have to believe that, right?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. And do you think people believe the peso is worth the U.S. dollar after it just come off 3,000% inflation?
Probably not.
Okay, perfect. So we can agree that's reasonable why that policy would fail.
Again, I haven't necessarily looked specifically at the evidence if that's actually what happened, but sure, in the hypothetical, that's fine.
Okay, perfect. But now going back to current Malay's
Yeah,
policy.
you're welcome.
We could agree that when Malay couldn't get the dollars to dollarize, he tried to dollarize naturally by allowing citizens to spend their dollars in the Argentinian economy.
Not necessarily. We've tried to give them money in order to dollarize. In fact, yes, it was naturalized. We were able to, we gave them money, they had a lot of dollars, and they said it showed that the people don't want it.
Okay, we could agree the United States government didn't give them money, just Malay recognized that people already had dollars saved, so he was trying to incentivize people to spend the dollars so it would circulate in the economy.
You guys talked about how we had a fund where it was to try to fight off their debt, and so that was, we weren't necessarily like donating them money, but we were giving them the money in order to, one, dollarize, and two, to fight off their debt.
Okay, would Argentinians who have their dollars saved to fight inflation want to spend those dollars?
I guess so, I don't know.
So you're saying that, okay, like, let's say for example, the United States, a lot of people have gold saved to hedge against inflation, right?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. Would people, like, do people want to use gold that they have saved in just regular transactions?
I mean, it depends. People like to spend money, but also they like to save money, so it depends on the person, I guess.
So people who save gold just go to the grocery store with like a gold ingot and are just.
No, not necessarily. If they're trying to save it and they want to save it, they'll save it, but if they're in a time of crisis, they will spend it.
All right, perfect. And we can agree that when Malay couldn't get money from the U.S. to dollarize, he was trying to get the Argentinian people to spend their dollar savings.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Basically, what I was saying is that there is a lot of dollars in Argentina right now. We've tried this idea of dollarization. We tried it back in 2001. You said that we tried it in 2023, and it still didn't work.
Okay, we can agree it's a different policy from trying to get citizens to spend their savings versus actually giving them the dollars they need so the citizens don't have to use their savings.
Not necessarily. Again, you were talking about this fund that was paying off their debt. That was giving them the dollars necessary.
All right, thank you so much. I'm out of time. I appreciate it.
All right, here's that evidence.
Oh, thank you.
Starting 5 minutes, have a first round.
Ready?
Yes, sir.
And the panel. There's a reason why Javier Milei, the current president of Argentina, ran and won on the platform of dollarization. There is a reason why the third-ranked economist in the entire world, an advisor to Ecuador when they dollarized, an advisor to Montenegro when they dollarized, and a key economic advisor to President Donald Trump champions the affirmative teams plan as the way to provide stability and a path forward for bilateral trade with Argentina and for Argentina's economy in and of itself. Dollarization is, like we stated in the 1EC, the best solution. Let's get to the responses. Starting off with their solvency, the root issue remains. They talk about how dollarization without shocks and how, sometimes the businesses wouldn't be fully able to and be fully compatible with the United States economy. My response you can write down is at best, short-term difficulty. Again, at best, short-term difficulty. Think of it this way. Let's say you have a whole bunch of credit card debt and you try to go on a plan and on a budget plan, you listen to Dave Ramsey and you were inspired and you try to get on his baby steps. Yes, of course there are going to be hiccups along the way, but that doesn't mean that the end goal is a bad solution. 2 subpoints to illustrate this. Subpoint A, dollarization hedges bad policy. Again, dollarization hedges bad policy. The negative team's argument says that there will be bumps along the way, and I actually agree. But the issue is, with dollarization, or the issue is for the negative team rather, is that dollarization provides a solution to those bumps on the way, provides stability on the way there. According to Marcos Falcone, writing for the Cato Institute, May 19th of 2026, quote, as Ocampo explained, Ecuador dollarized in 2000 under conditions that were by any measure worse than Argentina's today. An unpopular president, a country in sovereign debt, deposits frozen in the banking system, and the IMF actively opposed to the move. Yet the dollar has now outlasted every constitution Ecuador has had since 1830. Over the past 2 decades, inflation in Ecuador has disappeared. The country's private credit as a share of GDP stands at roughly 60%. And Ecuadorians can get 20-year mortgage loans. Neither Argentines nor Venezuelans can. Ocampo added that every year Argentina delays dollarization is a year of foregone growth. GDP is expected to grow by 3.5% in 2026, well below what a dollarized economy growing from a low base should be able to achieve. Impact provides best foundation. Again, provides best foundation. Sure, maybe in the short term and at the beginning when we dollarize, of course, there's a shift. There's going to be a couple of bumps on the way. But the angle is not a bad idea. Rather, it's a great one for the piece of evidence that we provided. I'm going to group their two disadvantages about the political losses and the impossible policy kind of as the same and group respond to the both of them because they're kind of hinging off the same ideas. They believe they're pretty interconnected. My response to the two of them is first, no evidence of real dollarization. Again, no evidence of real dollarization. Here's the problem with what the negative team is saying, is they talk about how we tried dollarization in the past in the 2000s. That's not exactly true. There's no evidence of real dollarization that we actually provided them the funds necessary. What we did, or what Argentina did, was peg their currency to the US dollar. The reason that failed is because that was not true. No one believed that at all. According to Gabriela de Burgos and Daniel Reisbeck, writing from the Cato Institute of August 31st, 2023, they write, quote, dollarization failed in Argentina in the 1990s. False. In the 1990s, Argentina had a currency board that exchanged dollars for pesos, a system that is sometimes confused with dollarization. In fact, equating that exchange rate system with dollarization is misleading. Whenever the negative team says we tried dollarization and failed, no, we didn't. We pegged the peso to the dollar, but no one believed that because it was not worth the same thing at all. Second response, different dollarization policy. Again, different dollarization policy. Then again, in 2023, Milei tried to dollarize his currency. The problem is, he didn't have any dollars. Subpoint A you could write down as couldn't get funds. Again, couldn't get funds. This is quoting the Financial Times, May 22nd of 2025. There it is, quote, Milei, who campaigned on a pledge to dollarize the economy, but was hamstrung by the lack of dollars in Argentina's central bank, is now championing an endogenous dollarization in which greenbacks gradually displace the pesos, end quote. You're probably thinking, Malachi, what in the world is endogenous dollarization? My subpoint B is endogenous dollarization. Again, endogenous dollarization. Give you a bit of an economy lesson here, but explain exactly what that means. AP News, from actually the same very day of the evidence that I last read, writes, quote, Milei's endogenous dollarization scheme would involve fixing the supply of the local currency even as Argentines could use dollars or pesos. He hopes that this would encourage Argentines to use their dollar-denominated savings to buy houses and cars as the economy grows and more cash is needed in circulation, end quote. I want to explain what that means. Endogenous dollarization is when you try to dollarize using the existing dollars in circulation. But the reason why that failed is because the peso is so volatile that people wanted to hold on to their cash in their dollars as a hedge and as protected. They didn't want to spend that because they would lose that. Similar idea. Endogenous dollarization in Argentina is the same as gold in the United States. If there's a really volatile time, you don't want to go spending your gold if the economy goes bad. Why? Because that's the only thing of value that you actually have. And he didn't have the dollars necessary to fully dollarize his economy, and no one wanted to comply, and Argentinians didn't want this specific kind of dollarization because they actually want to keep and maintain their dollars. Subpoint C, didn't want to spend. Again, didn't want to spend. The Buenos Aires Times, writing in May 23rd of 2025, wrote, quote, Argentina's government estimates that there are 200 billion so-called mattress dollars out there, 5 times the reserve of the central bank. It later goes on to say countless people lost life savings as the system collapsed over and over. Inflation spiraled out of control. Governments imposed currency controls. Their fingers burnt. Many Argentines took to trading their battered pesos for whatever greenbacks they could lay their hands on and hoarding them at home in cash. Impact you can write down as only hindrance is funding. Again, only hindrance is funding. According to the Buenos Aires Herald, writing October 13th of last year, they wrote, quote, dollarization could be an alternative, but for now it's off the table, Caputo said on Sunday night in an interview with Ellen Plus News Channel after returning from his week-long stay in Washington. At this moment, we don't have enough dollars to guarantee a successful dollarization, end quote. We saw that the reason it didn't work is not because dollarization is a bad idea, but because Milei wanted to do it, but he just couldn't do it. What we provide them is the opportunity to dollarize. Their disadvantages are irrelevant. Response to the solvency and constitutionality, no constitutional issue. Again, no constitutional issue. The same article from Gabriela de Burgos, right, from the Cato Institute, February 16th of 2024, says, quote, since the Argentine government already fixes an exchange rate without needing to go to Congress, it could also set the rate at which all pesos would cease to circulate. In other words, it is perfectly feasible for Argentina to dollarize without Congress's approval and without removing Congress's constitutional mandate to issue currency, end quote. What that means is there are constitutional ways to dollarize and unconstitutional ways to dollarize. Of course, the affirmative team doesn't force Argentina to say, hey, you have to use this one means. No, some ways are constitutional, some ways are not. Obviously, Argentina would dollarize in the way that is legal and constitutional for them to do so. What we've seen from this speech is first, that the justifications of the affirmative team still stand. That dollarization not only provides benefits to the Argentinian economy, but primarily for the United States, and it's perfectly solid in doing that. I appreciate your time.
We can agree that there was already a fund set aside basically for Argentina, right?
You mean the 40 billion?
Yes.
Yes.
And what was the purpose of that?
The purpose of the fund was to pay back loans from the United States and from places like the International Monetary Fund.
All right, and what do you propose switching the purpose to?
I propose, as again we said in our mandate, making sure that those funds set aside can only be used for the purposes of full dollarization.
So for clarification, they're no longer using to pay off their debt, but rather for dollarization.
Yeah, the conditions for pulling money out of that pool is for dollarization.
Okay, and you read in your evidence throughout the money scene in your speech that your plan only works if you completely dollarize Argentina.
Yeah, that's the point of our plan, is to dollarize Argentina.
Of course, and that means that every peso is switched to a dollar.
Yes, but we do not mandate exactly how that happens. Argentina gets to decide how dollarization works. Of course, some of these are constitutional, some are not. I mean, constitutional, regular constitutional. They'll do the constitutional route.
Okay, and there was a $40 billion fund.
Yes.
All right, and how much dollars worth of pesos do they have in Argentina?
The dollar amount, like, what do you mean dollars worth? Like dollars worth in pesos?
Right. Well, how much money do they have in Argentina? And we can translate it to dollars.
Yeah, so it'd be $15 billion as of right now for us to dollarize Argentina.
To completely dollarize every single peso.
To completely dollarize every peso, it would be $15 billion. They just need the extra in order to have that as reserve in the central bank.
And why would using U.S. dollars be preferable for the Argentine people?
Because it's actually worth something. I think that's a step in the right direction. Second is they've already been using it in a lot of trade. And third, because they use the dollar and because they can have that exchange rate and the barriers are removed between trade between the United States and Argentina, it's going to increase a lot of bilateral cooperation and business opportunities between the two countries.
All right, and in your responses to this idea of constitutionality and the political loss, you essentially said that Milei is able to bypass everybody else.
That he does not need the congressional approval to dollarize his currency. He does not need approval of Congress.
So for clarification, he still is bypassing Congress, even though it's still considered constitutional.
I think bypass is the wrong word because that's a bit of a negative connotation. He legally does not need the approval of Congress to dollarize.
And what did Milei say in April of 2026 about whether or not he wants to dollarize?
He said that his dollarization plan in 2023 was not effective and that the Argentinian people did not like that. They didn't like it because they wanted to save their dollars. They didn't want to spend their dollars because they have it in circulation.
And to be clear, your plan is dependent on Milei agreeing.
Yes, our plan is dependent on Milei agreeing.
All right. And once again, what did Milei say in April of 2026 about his intention to or to not dollarize?
To reference back to my answer to that question, the Argentinian people do not want to dollarize underneath Milei's specific plan. I understand what your evidence says, but the problem is you don't read it in context. I provided the necessary context showing that your argument is irrelevant.
Okay, thank you. Can I see your evidence?
Absolutely. Let me just make sure.
8 minutes on the clock, if you guys are ready. And the negative team, or affirmative team, used to being on affirmative. Let's go ahead and get started. Martin Rapetti in 2023 writes, quote, Argentina adopting the greenback would clash with the Constitution, augur hyperinflation, and risk defaults. The consequences would be devastating, end quote. I want you to imagine that your little sibling just built a giant Lego tower, and he thinks it's really cool. Then you take a 500-pound medicine ball, just absolutely smash it on the top. That's what the affirmative team is doing to our only ally in the entire region in Latin America. Milei has gotten elected, and the people say, we do not want dollarization. Milei wants to, obviously, since he's in a democracy, get the support of his people. And by forcing on him something that he doesn't want to do, you hand a political loss to the guy that we desperately need to be in power. In this speech, I'm going to give you an observation, go through responses to the 1AC, and show why even if you agree with the principle of their plan, you shouldn't pass it, because it's not going to change anything. This observation you can write down as only works in niche economies. Again, only works in niche economies. This is talking more about like the precedent. What happened when we tried this before? This is from Gilberto Garcia Vasquez in 2024. Quote, dollarization has only succeeded in niche economies. Argentina's size and structural challenges make it an unsuitable candidate, end quote. Even if you agree with the idea of dollarization in general, the reality is that it's only worked in niche economies. The ones they brought up were Ecuador and like Montenegro, these tiny little economies where it worked. Argentina's size and structural problems that are embedded into its economic situation make dollarization completely unfeasible. So the impact you can tag is unsuitable candidate. Again, unsuitable candidate. They're just not the right ones we should be doing this with. Maybe for another country, but not Argentina. Let's get into some responses. Their background point was about extreme volatility, essentially that there's inflation. That's a necessary result of the fact that their economic situation has been in turmoil for a very long time. But my response to this, you can tag as Malay stabilizing. Again, Malay stabilizing. Maurice Obstefeld, writing for the Peterson Institute for International Economics in February of 2026. This is more recent than any of their evidence they've read. Quote, like a modern Houdini, Argentina's President Javier Milei has escaped serial financial perils, emerging each time with a revised monetary framework. Argentina's last monetary scheme, which debuted on January 2, 2026, is designed to patch some of the predecessor's defects in pursuit of further inflation reductions, more foreign exchange reserves, and renewed economic growth. The scheme could work, especially if backed by continual bilateral and multilateral financial support and a timely return to financing from global capital markets. But it contains new vulnerabilities that make the country's path to price stability unnecessarily narrow, end quote. What does this mean? Well, Milei is taking a slow and steady type of approach towards stabilizing his peso. If you try to be all strict with him and say, you're just gonna completely dollarize now, that disrupts his entire process that he's currently doing. And why is that a problem? Well, they talked about in their justification 1, about how there's an economic benefit for Argentina. I'm gonna have 2 responses. My first one you can tag as cherry-picked problem. Again, cherry-picked problem. They have a lot of problems in their economic system, and they said, we're gonna try to solve one. But the problem is Milei has to run on this very tight line, balancing different objectives. He has to pay down his debt, and he has to stabilize their economy through stopping the inflationary pressures, while stopping bank runs for creating recession. So he's balancing all these different things by prioritizing one all the way over the others that disrupts his current system of actually stabilizing his economy. And secondly, it makes him reliant on United States policy decisions while taking away his inherent flexibility with the peso. This is from Narayan Amanachi in January 2024. Quote, dollarization would hand over Argentina's economic fate to the US, leaving it defenseless against domestic crises and global shocks. And expert Jose Luis in 2023, quote, full dollarization would strip Argentina of essential fiscal and monetary tools, turning even minor recessions into major crises, end quote. Let me explain the logic behind this. If Argentina switches to the dollar, then they would have to default on their loans. Right now, what happens if there's a loan that comes due and they don't have a way to pay it, they're able to devaluate their currency and be able to pay back that loan eventually. Now, Milei has been working on that, so he doesn't have to do that as much anymore. But as they agreed in cross-ex, there's so many bank runs that he has to have that as an option to prevent his economy from spiraling down into collapse and recession. So instead of that, the affirmative team is trying to transfer all that power and flexibility that it currently has over towards dependency on the US federal treasury, which is going to tie the hands of our partner in the region. My next response to this, you can write down as the impact of reduces flexibility to that same argument. This is from Jarague in 2023. Quote, the economists warned that if Argentina were to dollarize, its use of the US currency would bring Argentina's inflation in step with its northern neighbor. But this would take away the flexibility the country needs to respond to shocks, triggering periods of recession and high unemployment. That's what I was just talking about. Why are there shocks? because when the Argentinians freak out and they go on these bank runs and try to withdraw all their money at the same time, currently Argentina's President Milei has some options, some tools at his disposal because he has control of the peso. When you shift that over to the United States, that disrupts all of that. Now their justification too was about challenges Chinese control. And my response to that is you can tag as the exact opposite. Again, the exact opposite. Now the argument I'm gonna make is kind of similar to my partner's argument, and she's gonna do a great job with that, but I kind of had to get it on the front because it's a really, really good argument. So subpoint A you can write down is Milei won't deal with China. Again, Milei won't deal with China. Milei is actually pivoting towards the United States, but if you hand him a political loss, then the purists who are his opposition, they started the Falkland Wars against the UK, they hate the United States, they're really into Argentina's sovereignty, they don't really want to trade or anything like that. They're the ones that are going to cooperate with China. According to Ariel Gonzalez-Lavagui and Claudio Ravello in 2025, quote, Milei's foreign policy reorientation has been reinforced through frequent and high-profile contact with U.S. President Donald Trump. Following Trump's victory in 2024, Milei became the first foreign leader to visit him, traveling to Mar-a-Lago and addressing a conservative gala in which the president was in attendance. Later, quote, Argentina's pivot comes amid heightened U.S.-China competition in Latin America. Over the past decade, China has become deeply embedded in Argentina's economic landscape, becoming the country's second largest trading partner after Brazil, end quote. The Peronists were in charge for like 50 years. They had trade ties to China, and then Milei came along, and he was like really good for the United States. Because instead of cooperating with China, he cooperates with the United States. The idea that Milei is just gonna have this policy with China and one-eyes, I don't even know how you'd say that with the Chinese currency, that's not true. He's actually working with the United States. However, the opposition is the one that would cooperate closely with China. That's what they create. They create a political win for the opposition. And then my next response to this idea that you can tag as failed in other countries. That's failed in other countries. Let's look at what actually happened when he tried this. This is Gilberto Garcia Vasquez in 2024. Quote, Ecuador. After dollarization, Ecuador's inflation rate dropped from over 90% to single digits, showing immediate stabilization. However, it became more vulnerable to external shocks, such as fluctuating oil prices. End quote. If you take away anything from his speech, it's this. Their policy fails, it takes away Milei's flexibility, and it hands a political loss to our ally in the region. I'm ready for cross-sects.
Okay. I'd love to see the evidence of your written speech.
Yeah, for sure. You can ask me questions.
Let's start with your observation point. How does your observation about only working in niche economies, Argentina not being one of them, interact with our evidence in the 1AC that said that dollarization is the best solution for Argentina?
Yeah, so what it says is from one expert from the United States. He's not in Argentina, he's not an Argentinian economist. What our evidence specifically said was Argentina's size and structural challenges mean that Milei has to have the flexibility to respond to bank runs and other types of financial shocks by forcing him to dollarize ahead of schedule at the cost of him paying off his debt. That's going to do the exact opposite of what you want to do.
Let's actually talk about that ability to pay down debt in the recessions. What economic activity leads to not being able to pay down your debt and leads to recessions?
Fiscal irresponsibility. There you go.
Fiscal irresponsibility in the form of what?
And then I think I read this one and the first one.
Thank you.
Fiscal, like you're spending more than you take in revenue. So Argentina has a lot of problems. They're in debt to the IMF. They have hyperinflation. They have bank runs. Their people, need money. They need stability. They don't have that under the Peronists. Milei has been trying to stabilize their economy. That's what I talked about in my inherency point. But you're trying to push him ahead of schedule on one aspect of his economy. It's going to come at the cost of stabilizing the other aspects of his economy.
Okay, but the root issue of that is fiscal irresponsibility in the form of inflation, correct?
Well, in the form of inflation, in the form of spending a lot, in the form of debt, there are a lot of ideas related to this. Argentina's president is doing a good job of actually stabilizing his economy through his own means. You're trying to make him dependent on the United States and get rid of the tools he needs.
Let's talk about that inability to pay down debt.
Sure.
We can agree that we have an inability to pay down debt because people do not want to receive their payments in the form of the peso. Yes or no?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
We can agree that Argentina has an inability to pay down debt because people do not want to be paid in pesos.
No, what your evidence said in the 1AC was it's kind of a risky investment to give loans to Argentina because they may or may not be able to pay it off because their economy is in crisis.
I'm so sorry, but I'm not talking about the United States. I'm talking about Argentina's ability to pay back their debts. We can agree that they have an inability to do so because people do not want to be paid back in the form of pesos, correct?
Sure, that would be one of them. But currently, the United States and Malay's response to that is to use United States money as a form of kind of foreign aid that does eventually get paid back, that is actually able to allow them to pay that. That's the entire currency swap that you're talking about here when I see the back.
Okay, and we can agree that people do not want to be paid back in pesos because the pesos have no value.
I understand what you're trying to say. You're trying to say that it will help Argentina's economy to pay down its debt because they dollarize. That is just not true.
I'm not making an argument. I'm just trying to ask and to just get some clarity here.
That's one of the factors.
Okay,
Correct.
awesome. Looks like we're almost out of time, so I guess I'll just stop there. I appreciate your time.
Thanks.
It's because the medicine ball is bigger than my brother ever realized, and I'm going to provide evidence for this. I'd ask you to vote for the negative team, because the reality is that Malay is a little Lego man, and if we're dropping a 5,000-pound medicine ball, then that's going to completely obliterate his political career, and it's going to obliterate the ally that the United States has left. Let's look at the evidence for this when I jump into some responses. They started off by basically talking about, in response to my root issues remain, they said a lot of different things. They said the dollarization hedges, they said how it provides the best foundation. I have 4 responses to this. The first is the people still have to implement. That's the people still have to implement. Regardless of whether or not that the dollar becomes the legal tender of Argentina, the people still have to choose to use the dollar. It doesn't necessarily remove that. My second response, though, is the loss of autonomy. That's the loss of autonomy. Why does it matter that the people would have to choose to do this? Why does it matter that this would become the legal tender? Well, according to the CFI, the Corporate Finance Institute, in 2024, quote, dollarization carries with it the risk of a loss of autonomy for a developing country that adopts it. When a country does not build and develop its own currency, it runs the risk of allowing its monetary policy controlled by a foreign country. If the developing country and the country's currency they are adopting enter a politically contentious relationship, it can spell disaster for the developing nation that relies on a currency that is not theirs. It may make it difficult for the country to fully develop if they do not have control over the money supply and currency within their nation, end quote. Here's the reality, is that the United States is bypassing Congress, bypassing the people, and trying to get Malay on their side. They're forcing their will upon the people of Argentina, developing a contentious relationship, and that's exactly what this evidence says. It says that 1, we would create a contentious relationship, but 2, if that happens, it develops the loss of autonomy and they become subject to supply shocks. My third response is they dropped the warrants. Once again, they dropped the warrants. I read a very complicated piece of events and I couldn't pronounce half of the words in it, but most of what it was saying was that when a particular country has a supply shock or a recession, and on the other hand, when America has those same things, they don't necessarily align with one another. And when one country is dependent on another country's currency, that leads to the problems. They didn't address the logic behind this or the evidence. And my final response is paying off debt stabilizes. Once again, that's paying off the debt stabilizes. I asked in cross-examination what this $40 billion fund was originally for and what they're trying to switch it to. The reality is that it used to be for trying to pay off the debt. But here's the problem. If you really want to stabilize Argentina and if you really want to benefit the United States, we would keep it at that. According to Maurice Obstfeld in 2026, quote, it looks like Argentina might run out of reserves and devalue or allow the rate to float. That would have blown up Malay's entire program, risking renewed inflation and dealt a possibly fatal blow to his electoral chances on October 26. Yet, Malay escaped disaster once more. The U.S. Treasury unexpectedly made $20 billion available to Argentina in the form of a swap facility, and in early October 2025, intervened directly in the Buenos Aires foreign exchange market, reportedly spending about $2.5 billion. The peso barely stayed within its band, and voters proved unwilling to return to the economic chaos of Pyrrhonism. They gave Malay's party an unexpected strong plurality in the 2025 midterm elections. Market confidence returned. Malay had won room to advance his economic program and run on the results of the October 2027 presidential election, end quote. The reality is that here in the United States, we don't know what's gonna get Malay reelected. Malay knows what's best for himself for re-election, and he's on America's side. When America forces his will, or forces our will onto Malay, that leads to political loss for Malay, but not only that, it leads to destabilization, because the current system is truly what is stabilizing the peso, not whatever the affirmative plans to do. They talked about how there's no evidence of real dollarization. My first response is they didn't address the claims. I made a bunch of claims with a bunch of warrants about how the people don't want it, how Malay doesn't want it as a result of that, and they didn't respond to these. They just basically said the precedent wasn't real. My second response is the tsunami of litigation. Again, a tsunami of litigation. According to Professor Martin Rapetti in 2023, quote, "The complexities don't end there. We talk of converting the central bank's pesos to dollars, but what would happen with the peso deposits in the financial system? What would happen with the entire contractual system that today is expressed in pesos? Proponents of dollarization tend to argue that the economy is already dollarized, and it's true that the bulk of assets we use are in dollars, and that property transactions are in that currency, but the bulk of the economy's transactional structures, salaries and rent, is in pesos. In few words, an attempt to dollarize would clash with the national constitution and run the risk of bringing down the economy into hyperinflation." The reality is that they didn't respond to these particular warrants, but not only that, there's an additional tsunami of litigation. And my final response is we should give them the choice. Once again, we should give them the choice. Regardless of the constitutionality, we're bypassing Congress, we're bypassing the people, and we should not bypass Malay as well. Thank you.
All right, 5 minutes if y'all are ready. Then let's get started. This round is very simple. They say we should not dollarize Argentina's economy because Milei is doing a great job at keeping his fiscal policy afloat and he doesn't want dollarization. That's what a lot of people were talking about last summer, when the currency was going great and the peso was low inflation and Milei's policies were working. And then in September, the currency crashed again, and the economy crashed again, and inflation shot up again. That even though Milei has been in power for 4 years, there's been constant devaluations, current currency crisis, which is why Milei has continued to advocate to switch to the dollar. Let's break everything they said down into 3 clashes. I'm going to group everything together and we'll respond to everything they said. I'm just not going to go line by line. The first clash you can write down is dollarization. Again, dollarization. I'm going to address what they talked about with the people want it, the government wants it, and constitutionality. Simple A you can write down as people want dollarization. Again, people want dollarization. First of all, they did not respond to the evidence in the 1AC from October of 2025 saying that dollarization is the solution most desired by Argentina's people. Also, they agreed in cross-examination they voted for Milei for the purpose of dollarizing. Let me ask you, what is more likely? Do you think it's likely that the people who want dollarization in 2023 and just a couple months ago in 2025 suddenly changed their minds just a couple months later and now widespread nobody wants dollarization? It's what's a popular thing now. No, because the interview was out of context. The context of the interview was about his specific dollarization policy. He was saying that the people didn't want to spend their dollar savings. The policy he passed was endogenous dollarization. Malachi gave the context, they did not refute the context, the people want dollarization and they didn't refute that evidence. Some point B you can write down is government wants dollarization. Again, government wants dollarization. This is according to John Cassidy, writing for the New Yorker. He says, quote, "Despite this stash of dollars, however, almost all experts believe that to make his plan work, Milei's government would need to borrow a large sum of dollars from abroad. Milei too has acknowledged the dilemma. If someone comes and gives me the $30 billion in cash, I can solve it in 1 day." End quote. We give him that $30 million in cash to use it for dollarization. That's exactly what he's asking for. They say we're forcing it on them. But if it's the solution most desired by the people, if it's exactly what Milei is asking for, and their economic minister, Luis Caputo, literally, Malachi read evidence for saying that dollarization is still on the table, we just need the dollars to do it. That is the solution in Argentina. Some points you can write down is perfectly constitutional. Again, perfectly constitutional. This is according to Dr. Emilio Ocampo, writing for Dollarization in Argentina, September 19, 2025. They write, quote, "A law wouldn't be necessary to dollarize the currency. Furthermore, under the proposed format, it would be perfectly constitutional." End quote. Why does this matter? The evidence they read about constitutionality was talking about the 2023 proposal. But as of 2025, they have a new one that is perfectly constitutional and wouldn't need Congress and is actually perfectly compliant. Second category to write down as U.S. benefit. Again, U.S. benefit. So point A you can write down as a foothold over China. Again, a foothold over China. They basically said that the opposing party, if Milei loses, would be closer to China. But this isn't even true, because our 1AC evidence said that Milei himself literally made a deal with China's government to use the yen in international trade. This is why it's so important we increase the credibility of our dollar. This is according to Nicholas Kaczynski, writing for the Economic Order on October 28th of last year. He says, quote, "Formal dollarization would increase demand for U.S. dollars. Even though Argentina is already informally dollarized, official adoption would bring into additional international demand for dollars as it would receive legal tender status." End quote. Meaning that you actually give us a foothold over China because more countries desire our currency. So point B you can write down as trade. Again, trade. They completely did not interact with the evidence that said that post-dollarization in Argentina, it increases trade by 400%. That means more American goods are bought, more American economies are invested in. Moving on to the last category, you can write it down as Argentina benefits. Again, Argentina benefits. They keep telling you that it's a bad thing that they lose flexibility over their economy. So what you can write down is flexibility is the issue. Again, flexibility is the issue. Let me put it to you this way. Argentina has been able to conduct their own fiscal policy for decades. And what has that gotten them? What it has gotten them is 6 hyperinflations, banking crises, debt runs, defaults, and basically everything they're saying is a good thing about Argentina having flexibility to adjust has not worked. That's why they need to try something new. According to Patrick Ford, writing for City Journal in December 1st of 2023, he says, quote, "These arguments make sense for countries that pursue at least somewhat prudent macroeconomic policies, but are not persuasive in cases like Argentina's, where prolific fiscal policymakers pressure the central bank to monetize their spending. Currency crises and periods of high inflation are regular occurrences in Argentina's history. Since 2017 alone, the Argentina price level has risen 22-fold. A habitual drug driver should hand his car keys to a more responsible friend. The same is true for Argentina." That's what I ask you to vote out. Thanks.
Martina Jaraguay in 2023 writes, quote, "According to a letter signed by 170 prominent economists, it could cause serious harm without solving the country's undermining economic problems," end quotes. This was in an article titled that, I don't remember what it was titled, but it's talking about why the economists of Argentina hate dollarization, because it doesn't actually address the root problems. If you disagree that it talks about dollarization, well, I'm going to read the next sentence for you. Quote, "The economists warn that if Argentina were to dollarize, its use of the U.S. currency could bring Argentina's inflation in step with its northern neighbor, but this would take away from the flexibility the country needs to respond to shocks, triggering periods of recession and high unemployment." That was a card I read in my last speech. They never repeated that. And those 170 prominent economists is better advocacy than anything the affirmative team can throw at you in this room. Now, I want to make it very, very clear that the affirmative team has the burden of proof, both under the resolution, which they have to create a substantial policy reform and prove that their plan does that, and 2, to actually having a solvency, which is one of the 4 key stock issues. They don't do that. Their first argument was about how in October 2025, the people said that they want this, and Milei kind of ran on this. The problem is we read April 2026 evidence literally 1 month ago saying that Milei doesn't want it because the people don't want it anymore. The most recent evidence clearly sides with the negative team, and here's another one backing that up. According to Sergio Goschenko, writing in April 11, 2026, just a month ago, quote, "During a recent interview, President Javier Milei stated that the largest obstacle to dollarization in Argentina was that the people did not want it. He stressed that even when the government has approved the use of the dollar for financial transactions, people still do not use it," end quotes. Why is that? Because Argentina has so many structural problems and corruption embedded in the system that even when you were to dollarize, people still use the peso, number 1. 2, it doesn't solve the myriad of economic problems that they have, and it even makes problems worse. They talked about how the U.S. gets benefit and there's trade. My response to tag is fails empirically. Again, fails empirically. I already talked about how that just didn't work empirically in the other countries that tried it, but then we can see this more so in Gilberto Garciaso Vasquez's article in January 2024. Quote, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe's adoption of the US dollar stopped hyperinflation, but it led to liquidity problems and limited control over monetary policy, hindering economic growth, end quote. When you would expect to see increased trade, increased demand for the United States dollar. But if it forces Argentina's economy into recession and hurts the leader of the economy who's actually favoring trade with the United States, that does the exact opposite of what they wanted to. My voting issue number 1, you can write down as can't help Argentina's economy. Again, can't help Argentina's economy. There are a few reasons for this. Subpoint A, you can tag as still using the peso. Again, still using the peso. Even if you dollarize Argentina, there's so much corruption in the country, as my partner talked about, they're still just going to keep using the peso. You won't solve anything. That's backed up by Narayan Amachi in 2024. Quote, the investment bank emphasized that dollarization is typically successful only in countries with robust economic growth and ample foreign currency reserves. Even if Argentina could secure the necessary volume of dollars, JP Morgan warned that this strategy is inherently flawed and bound to fail. A similar experiment in Ecuador led to money laundering, strengthening the hands of criminal gangs. in quotes. It doesn't work. Argentina is so corrupt and its economy in such a dastardly position that forcing them to be completely perfect with their hyperinflation, tools takes away the tools that Milei needs to strengthen his economy and do it the right way with a slow and steady process, winning the race. Instead, the affirmative tries to throw that medicine ball on top of his tower, disrupts his own efforts, and force him to rely on the United States laws rather than make his own decisions. And that's subpoint B. The cheating tigers won't work. Again, won't work. Even if you agree with the entire argument of the negative team and agree with the principle of the affirmative team's case, you shouldn't pass their plan because Argentinians don't want it. Because of that, Javier Milei doesn't want that. And for their plan to work, they have to bypass the Congress as well as the judiciary system, meaning that that's going to hand a direct political loss to Milei, and it's not even going to work. He's not even going to want to adopt it. And that's voting issue number 2. You can tag as won't help the United States. Again, won't help the United States. Subpoint A, you can write down as overrides electorate. Again, overrides electorate. Why did we give them the current bailout in the first place? Well, it was to help Milei get elected again. If you change the purpose of that bailout, that reduces the ability of him to get elected again. It changes the focus away from what's already working. And subpoint B, you can tag as benefits fail in large unstable economies. Again, benefits fail in large unstable economies. It's empirically denied, and it's going to fail in Argentina too. Thank you.
When your personal finances are weakened, if you're drowning in debt, the way to get out of that situation is a loss of autonomy, prioritizing getting back value and hard work. Dollarization is all of those things. And every time we've tried it, the country who's receiving dollars and getting dollarized is the much better for it and much better off. This is according to Dr. Stephen Hank, Fortune magazine, October 13th of last year. He writes this: in 1999, when I was a state counselor to the government of Montenegro, it was a part of Yugoslavia, and Montenegro was using the highly inflationary Yugoslav dinar as its currency. I designed and implemented a currency reform that made the mighty German mark legal tender. Within days, the dinar quickly disappeared from circulation, and Montenegro became dollarized, with the mark replacing the dinar. I also advised Ecuador's finance minister, Carlos Julio Emanuel, and assisted when Ecuador replaced the unreliable sucre with the US dollar in 2001. In both cases, I heard objections similar to those raised about dollarizing Argentina. Today, Argentina's Minister of the Economy, Luis Caputo, and the wise men from the IMF sing about the same song sheet from dollarization. They assert that dollarization is not feasible and unwise. This is nonsense. As was the case in Montenegro and Ecuador, dollarization in Argentina is feasible and wise, end quote. 3 reasons to vote for the affirmative team. Voting issue 1, no solvency issues. Again, no solvency issues. The negative team has made a fatal mistake by actually not refuting the need of any of the argumentation that we provided. They continue to provide repetition, not refutation. I want to point you back to Cash and I's response when we continuously clarified throughout this hour-and-a-half debate exactly what Milei was talking about, what the Argentinian people were talking about when they said they didn't like dollarization. They cannot continue to keep talking about this piece of evidence, talking about how Milei said, oh, it was bad. No, we provided the necessary context. In my speech, I'm very sad that they did this because I spent a lot of time in my speech actually covering this argumentation, saying and showing how their argument is irrelevant because it was talking about his failed attempt to dollarize. You know why it failed? Because he didn't have dollars to dollarize. We provide that. There's no reason to believe. So if the negative team is telling me that Milei wanted to dollarize so badly that he implemented a plan that backfired, and that when we provided the necessary dollars to do so, that he just wouldn't accept that. That's what the negative team is telling you. We can see how illogical that sounds. Subpoint A, Argentina wants. Again, Argentina wants. Just because their evidence is more recent doesn't mean that it was read in context. We provided the context. Subpoint B, constitutional. Again, constitutional. Yes, maybe past plans were unconstitutional, but they have a recent proposal that is fully compliant with Argentinian law. We've spent multiple minutes of our speeches in the past covering this issue. It's not an issue anymore. Voting issue 2 is the Argentina benefit. Again, Argentina benefit. Subpoint A solves the root issue. Again, solves the root issue. Again, if you're in debt, if your financial situation is bad, if you can't pay for stoa tournaments for your kids, the solution is not to take out more debt. The solution is to, try to, get yourself in a better stable position. They didn't respond to the piece of evidence from Ecuador in my first speech, where I outlined how dollarization has helped Ecuador so much. I want to do even more of that in my speech. According to the Cato Institute, January 16th of this year, they wrote, quote, since adopting the dollar, January 9th of 2000, the country has enjoyed the longest period of monetary stability in its Republican history. Later it says, with dollarization, wages could no longer be diluted via inflation. Average inflation between 1975 and 1999 was 31.4%. It later goes on to say, after dollarization, average annual inflation fell to 3.4%, end quote. The reason why they can't pay off debt, the reason why they have recessions, is exactly what they agreed to when I cross-examined the negative team. Inflation. We solved that. Voting issue 3, U.S. benefit. Again, U.S. benefit. Because you don't pass this plan simply because it benefits Argentina and simply because we've proven solvency true. The reason you pass this plan is because we provided benefits for the United States. Why? First, we hedge against China. China is using its leverage over Argentina, trying to replace its trade with their own currency. Our evidence in the 1AC even said that the reason Argentina is accepting is because they have a lack of available dollars. We provide them that. Second reason, 400% trade increase. Again, 400% trade increase. They may have provided responses on the flow to our justifications, but they never clashed or disproved our evidence and our links and our justifications, showing how when you speak the same financial language, financial cooperation becomes much easier. That's why you vote out.